Last night, your soulmate's family asked about you. And your soulmate's answer left everyone speechless. Last night, while you were living another ordinary evening, believing nothing had changed, a conversation began in a house you've never seen. Your name entered the room without warning. Every voice suddenly grew quieter. Every pair of eyes turned toward the one person who knew the answer better than anyone else. Then a single question floated through the silence. What about them? No one expected what came next, not even your soulmate. The room waited. The air felt heavier than anyone could explain. A clock continued ticking against the wall, almost as if time itself refused to interrupt the moment. Your soulmate looked down at their hands instead of answering. Their family exchanged uncertain glances, wondering why such a simple question suddenly carried so much weight. What could possibly make someone hesitate this long before speaking your name? Finally, your soulmate took a slow breath. I've been trying to forget them. The words landed like stones in still water. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They had expected excitement, certainty, maybe even happiness. Instead, they heard a confession wrapped in quiet heartbreak. But those words were only the beginning of a truth no one in that room had ever imagined. One family member leaned forward. If you've been trying to forget them, why do you still think about them every day? Your soulmate smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile people wear when they're happy. It was the kind that appears when someone has carried a secret for too long. Their eyes drifted toward the window, where the darkness reflected a face that looked both hopeful and exhausted. They knew something no one else in the room understood, and they weren't sure they were ready to say it out loud. You had never met these people. You didn't know they existed. Yet somehow, pieces of your own story were quietly unfolding miles away. While you questioned your future, someone else was questioning why every road seemed to circle back to you. It wasn't coincidence that haunted them. It was possibility. What happened? Another voice finally asked. Your soulmate closed their eyes. I met someone who changed the way I see the world. Again, silence. But that single word hung in the room like an unfinished prayer. Everyone waited for the rest. They could all sense there was another chapter hidden behind that tiny pause. Something painful. Something unfinished. Something that still refused to let go. I wasn't ready. Those three words echoed through the house more loudly than anyone expected. Regret has a strange way of filling empty spaces. It settles into conversations, old photographs, forgotten songs, and quiet evenings when no one is watching. Your soulmate had learned that lesson the hard way. They had convinced themselves that timing mattered more than feelings, until one day they realized feelings never really disappear. They simply wait. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows. No one noticed at first. The sound blended with the silence until it became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate stared into the darkness beyond the glass, almost expecting an answer to appear somewhere between the falling drops. Instead, another memory surfaced, one they had tried to bury countless times. The first laugh. the first conversation, the first moment they realized someone could make ordinary life feel extraordinary. That memory had never truly left. A relative finally broke the silence. "So why don't you go back?" The question seemed simple enough, but life rarely offers simple answers. Your soulmate laughed softly, though there wasn't much joy inside it. "What if they don't feel the same anymore?" No one replied, because everyone in the room understood that fear. The fear of arriving too late. The fear of discovering someone else has already written the ending you wanted. The fear that hope itself can become another heartbreak. Your soulmate carried all three. Far away, you felt restless without knowing why. Maybe you couldn't sleep. Maybe you found yourself staring at the ceiling, replaying old conversations that no longer seemed important until now. Maybe you caught yourself wondering why certain memories refuse to fade. Sometimes the heart notices patterns long before the mind understands them. Back in that quiet house, an older family member stood and walked slowly toward your soulmate. Years had taught them that silence often reveals more than words ever could. They rested a gentle hand on their shoulder. "You still love them." It wasn't a question, it was recognition. Your soulmate didn't answer immediately. Tears gathered before words ever could. There are moments when emotions become too large for language, when even the strongest person realizes the truth has been patiently waiting beneath every excuse. This was one of those moments. Then came the answer that left everyone speechless. "I never stopped." No dramatic music filled the room, no miracle appeared, only honesty, pure, vulnerable honesty. Some family members lowered their eyes. Others quietly smiled. A few wiped away tears they hadn't expected to shed. In that single sentence, every unanswered question suddenly made sense. It wasn't that your soulmate had forgotten you. It was that forgetting had never truly been possible. Still, another truth remained hidden. One relative asked carefully, "If that's true, what's stopping you now?" Your soulmate looked toward the front door as though it represented every chance they had ever walked away from. "I'm afraid I've already missed the moment." No one rushed to comfort them. Sometimes hope needs silence before it can breathe. Outside, the rain slowed. Clouds drifted apart just enough for moonlight to spill across the porch. The light wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, gentle, almost unnoticed. Yet it transformed the entire view without making a sound. Something inside your soulmate shifted, not certainty, not confidence, just courage, the smallest kind, the kind that whispers instead of shouting, the kind that asks one impossible question: what if it's not too late? For the first time all evening, no one had an answer, because some stories aren't changed by certainty. They're changed by one brave step into the unknown, across the distance. Without understanding why, you felt the strange sensation that tomorrow might be different. Not because fate promised it. Not because the universe guaranteed it. But because life has a quiet way of surprising people who believe every meaningful chapter has already been written. You didn't know someone had finally spoken your name without hiding from it. You didn't know old fears were beginning to lose their grip. You didn't know a single decision was preparing to rewrite two lives at once. and as the first light of morning crept toward the horizon, your soulmate reached for their phone, stared at your contact for what felt like forever, and let one trembling finger hover over the screen, just before it lit up with an incoming message from a number neither of you recognized. Last night, everything changed, and you don't even know it yet, while you were living through another ordinary evening, wondering if anyone truly thought about you when you weren't around. A conversation was unfolding somewhere you never expected. It started with a simple question, one that seemed harmless enough. Then your name entered the room. The air shifted. Faces changed. Someone looked down at the table. Someone else held their breath. And before anyone could prepare for what was coming next, an answer was spoken that left every person in that room completely silent. You have no idea why that answer carried so much weight. Not yet. But if you had been standing just outside that door, listening through the silence that followed, you would have realized that this wasn't just another family conversation. It was the kind of moment that quietly changes the direction of lives without asking for permission. And the most unbelievable part is that it all happened while you were completely unaware that your story was being discussed. You know that strange feeling you sometimes get when your heart becomes heavy for no reason? When you suddenly stop what you're doing because it feels like something important is happening somewhere beyond your reach? Maybe it was only your imagination. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe moments like these leave echoes that somehow find their way back to you, long before you understand why they matter. The room wasn't filled with anger. It wasn't filled with celebration either. It was filled with something much harder to describe. Hope.
Mixed with fear. Excitement wrapped inside uncertainty. Every person sitting there had their own expectations, their own questions, their own version of how life should unfold. But no one expected your name to become the center of everything. One family member smiled carefully before asking the question that everyone had been avoiding for weeks. So, what about them? The room became incredibly quiet. It wasn't because nobody had an opinion. It was because everyone was waiting for one voice. Only one answer truly mattered, and when that answer finally came, nobody was prepared for what they were about to hear. You would probably expect something dramatic. Maybe a confession. Maybe a rejection. Maybe words overflowing with emotion. But real life rarely announces its biggest moments that way. Sometimes the simplest sentence carries the greatest power. Sometimes just a few carefully chosen words can shake years of assumptions. The answer came calmly, no hesitation, no excuses. No performance, just honesty. For a few endless seconds, nobody spoke. One person stared at the floor. Another slowly leaned back in their chair as though they were trying to process what had just happened. Even the people who believed they already knew the truth suddenly weren't so sure anymore. What exactly was said? That answer isn't as important as what it revealed, because words only matter when they expose something hidden beneath them. And hidden beneath those quiet sentences was a truth that had been growing for much longer than anyone realized. The conversation continued, but now every question sounded different. Every memory carried new meaning. Moments that once seemed ordinary suddenly looked like pieces of a much larger picture. People began connecting details they had ignored for months. A laugh that lasted a little too long. A glance no one thought mattered. A silence that suddenly made perfect sense. Have you ever looked back at your own life and realized the signs were there all along? That the biggest moments often disguise themselves as ordinary days until time finally reveals what they really meant? Maybe that's why the future always feels invisible while you're living inside it. If someone had asked you yesterday whether your life could change without you even being present, you probably would have laughed. But some conversations continue echoing long after the voices have disappeared. Some decisions begin forming before the people involved ever hear about them. The family wasn't only talking about you. They were trying to understand what your presence represented. Some believed you brought peace. Others wondered whether you would bring change. A few quietly feared that change often comes with sacrifice. No one agreed completely, yet somehow everyone felt the same strange certainty that your story had become connected to theirs in ways they couldn't fully explain. And somewhere beyond that conversation, you kept living your evening exactly as you always had. You answered messages. You finished small tasks. You distracted yourself from thoughts you didn't want to face. You believed the night belonged only to you. You never imagined your name had become the reason an entire room fell silent. Maybe that's how life works. The biggest turning points don't always announce themselves with flashing lights. Sometimes they arrive through whispered conversations you'll never hear. Sometimes your future begins moving while you're still convinced nothing is changing at all. But one person in that room noticed something no one else did. It wasn't spoken aloud. It wasn't written anywhere. It appeared only for an instant, hidden inside a single expression that vanished almost as quickly as it came. That tiny moment changed everything. Because it revealed that someone had been carrying a secret for far longer than anyone suspected, a secret connected to you, a secret connected to that unforgettable answer, a secret that, if revealed too soon, could transform every assumption everyone had been making from the very beginning. And just as someone finally gathered the courage to speak, the room fell silent once again.